but don't want to keep you all here who are here. So welcome. And it's neat that we can do this topic this morning. I've been talking a lot about federalism in Canada and the United States recently, and this is one of those areas where federalism lives out at the federal and sub-federal levels when we look at environmental regulation, how we get there. Provinces have a different role in the Canadian Federation than the states have in our federation, and I think this is going to play out very interestingly as we look at environmental assessment. So we are being webcast. This will go up later. If you have questions, wait for the microphone. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Andy Finn, Program Associate with the Canada Institute, who will moderate and give the bios to you, and we'll get started. So welcome and have a great conversation.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Just quickly go into some bios real quick for our panelists, and then we'll get started. So to my immediate left is Helen Cutts. She's the Vice President for Policy Development at the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. She's appointed Vice President in February of 2011, and before joining the agency, Helen was the Executive Director of Expenditure Analysis and Compensation Planning at Treasury Board of Canada's Secretariat. She received her MA from Princeton and her BA from Queen's University, both in the field of economics. Next to my left is Jim Kellfish. I think I said that right. He's the Senior Associate and Director of Sustainable Use of Land Program at the Environmental Law Institute. Jim's research focuses on development choices and their links to water resource, biological diversity, and infrastructure policy. He received his JD from Yale Law School and his BA from Dickinson College. To his left is Stephen Hazel, the Director of Conservation and General Counsel of Nature Canada. Stephen is the Director of he is also the Adjunct Professor at the University of Ottawa, where he teaches environmental and natural resource law. He has MA from University of Toronto and a JD from Queen's University. And finally, to his left is Fred Wagner, who's a principal at Beveridge and Diamond law firm in town here. He joined Beveridge and Diamond back in 1991, but recently served or was appointed as Chief Counsel to the FHWA, an agency of the Department of Transportation here in Washington. He received his JD from the University of Virginia Law School and his BA from Tufts University. So without further ado, Helen's going to lead us off, and please take it away.
All right, I'm pleased to give you an overview of the regime that we have at the federal level for environmental assessment. I'm an executive member of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, which is a fairly small agency with about 250 employees. We have a head office in Ottawa, and then we have 5 regional offices across the country because that's where the projects are. Our new act came into force in 2012, so we've had about 2.5 years experience with it. And it's a system whereby we use a project list. Project list is defined in regulation outlining the types of projects which are subject to the Act. So it will list things like a mine of a particular size, a road of a particular length. These designated projects enter a screening phase, and then if they pass the screening phase, they go into a full environmental assessment. It's also possible for projects to be designated by the Minister of the Environment. I'd like to focus on about 4 or 5 areas this morning to tell you about the types of changes we made to the Act relative to the former Act and why we made them. So, as many of you may know, both the federal government and the provincial governments have responsibility for environment. So with the shared responsibility, we end up with a system where both the provinces and the federal government are doing environmental assessment. We tried to develop a new act that would better reflect a division of labor, so to speak, between the two areas. And we focused more intently on areas of federal jurisdiction in the new act. We also did some streamlining, and finally we strengthened environmental protection by adding more enforcement teeth to the Act. So I'll go through a bit of the streamlining we did, as well as changes in terms of enforceability. So to begin with, we are focusing now on major projects. So the types of projects that we've listed in our regulation are those where we feel have the greatest potential for significant adverse environmental effects. We are also focusing on federal jurisdiction for those effects. So, for example, if there are effects of the project on fish, or if there are effects on migratory birds, those are considered federal effects. Other federal effects are a bit more logical to those outside Canada, and anything that has a transboundary effect is considered federal. So obviously, if there's some issue related to Manitoba and Saskatchewan, it's crossing two borders, it makes sense that the federal government be involved. Obviously, we also are looking at international effects, so some activity in Canada that affects, say, a watershed in the United States is something of federal domain. If there's federal funding or federal decisions, then we're also looking at the projects. Finally, concerns related to Aboriginal peoples. If there are effects from the environment that affect their way of life, they affect their socioeconomic well-being or their health, then it's mandated that we look at those effects. So between the focus on major projects and this narrowing of the effects, that constituted in itself a major element of streamlining, because previously there were a great number of small projects which were examined by the Environmental Assessment Agency. Anything that was funded by the government, even however small, needed to be examined. A second type of streamlining related to the timelines. So what we have in Canada now, we have two ways of doing environmental assessments. The first way is where federal officials are conducting the environmental assessment, preparing a report for the minister, and asking the minister for her decision. The second way we do environmental assessments is for the more complicated projects where there's areas of public concern. The minister will appoint a group of individuals who are experts in the domain to carry out a panel review. And those are used more rarely, but when they are used, it's typical 3 members of a panel will hold public hearings and will necessarily take longer to do its analysis. In the end, their report is provided to the Minister of the Environment for her decision. So in each case, a report is prepared, and in each case, the minister prepares a statement as to whether the effects of the project are significant or not, and also what the mitigation measures are. So these mitigation measures are taken into account as she determines significance. For each of the 2 streams, the one that's done by public officials and the one that's done by the independent panel, there are separate timelines. For the one done by public officials, 365 days is the limit, and that limit is only government time. The idea was that in the old regime, sometimes projects were taking a long time to get through the system, and when we thought about it, we realized that it made sense for us to constrain ourselves in the pace in which we carried out the assessment, which involved sending the instructions to the proponent and analyzing the proponent's work. So if you think of it as very simply 3 phases. We get the instructions out to the proponent. Then the proponent does an analysis on the ground, trying to understand the effects. And then our phase again, reviewing it. We only put the clock on our own time so that the analysis portion done by the proponent is not constrained. And I think that that is a good innovation. Of course, the provinces are very important. They have a lot of the land in Canada, and they have an important role to play in environmental assessment. We wanted to make sure that there was as little duplication as possible and that we could work together as well as possible. And we introduced some measures in the new act that would allow for a more coordinated approach that economized on the resources needed to do the environmental assessment. So we introduced something called substitution, and in that arrangement, instead of having both the federal officials and the provincial officials conducting the environmental assessment, that work is done and reviewed by the province. The province prepares a single report that is made available both to the Minister of the Environment at the federal level and their own minister at the provincial level. So what happens is, while we are economizing on how the environmental assessment is carried out, the federal minister still retains her decision-making power, and there's a certain amount of checks and balances that are put in place so that we at the federal government can ensure that we have a good report from the province that is going to be useful for our minister to make her decision. We also set out conditions that the province must respond to, and we would only authorize if those conditions are in place. We also have to ensure that the particular project that's up for substitution is an appropriate substitute, and that means that if there are transboundary concerns with the United States, we would not be seeing that as a candidate for substitution. Finally, I'll just conclude my remarks with a comment on enforcement and compliance. In the previous regime, like in the United States, there were the environmental assessment mitigation conditions that are outlined in the report are not enforceable. This is in the previous regime. And the enforcement took place at the permitting stage. So once the project passed through the planning review, the permitting departments were charged with developing the permits and putting conditions in. But there's not a one-to-one correspondence in that there could be conditions in the environmental assessment report that do not lend themselves to permits. So in the new regime, we defined the environmental assessment decision statement as an enforceable document in and of itself. So it's laying out enforceable conditions for proponents. And then we are now in the process of developing an enforcement and compliance regime so that we can carry out the work that we need to do to ensure that proponents comply. So all in all, we have a regime that is more streamlined, improves the federal-provincial dimension, improves the compliance regime, and it maintains features of the old regime, which include good public participation, as well as integrating Aboriginal consultation throughout the process.
Terrific. We're going to have Stephen speak next.
All right, take it away. Morning, everyone. Thanks to Andrew for the invitation to participate in the forum. I work for a group called Nature Canada, which I suppose the closest analog in the United States is the Audubon Society. In fact, 75 years ago, Audubon came to Canada, called itself the Canadian Audubon Society, and Nature Canada grew out of that. So I'm there as Director of Conservation and Legal Counsel. We do a lot of things. We consider ourselves to be the voice for nature in Ottawa, and we also are very much trying to get Canadians out into nature, the experience of nature, et cetera. So those are our two mission statements at the moment. What I wanted to do this morning was, given that Keystone, when Americans think about Canada at all, the word Keystone probably springs to mind most often. I thought it would be interesting to talk very quickly about the pipelines that are actually being assessed and approved in Canada. How are we doing in Canada in terms of bringing those pipelines online? So I thought I would talk a little bit about that process. So there's 4 of them that I wanted to talk about very briefly for each of them. What challenges are they facing in terms of their assessment, approval, construction? And the big question, are any of them actually ever going to be built? So the 4 of them are the Mckenzie Gas Project, the Northern Gateway Project, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, also in British Columbia, and Energy East. So pipelines are regulated through the National Energy Board, which is a federal authority, and the National Energy Board has exclusive, comprehensive authority to license and regulate interprovincial, international pipelines in Canada. The mandate of the board was changed somewhat in 2012 at the same time that the changes to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act were made, and those changes that Helen mentioned in her presentation. Now the National Energy Board is no longer a full quasi-judicial body. Now it actually makes recommendations to Cabinet, and Cabinet actually has authority to approve a project or not approve a project as it sees fit, whatever the National Energy Board says. So there's a bit of a difference under the new act, the new National Energy Board Act, than under the previous legislation. So let's talk about some of these pipeline projects. I wanted to start first with the Mckenzie Gas Project, because the assessment of this project is really what created a lot of the aggravation within government that led to much of the measures in SIA 2012. This project runs from the Mackenzie Delta down to Alberta. It would have been the largest industrial project ever in Canada's north, 1,300 kilometers, 3 production fields in the Mackenzie Delta, and it was led by Imperial Oil with ExxonMobil, Shell, and ConocoPhillips. The process started back in 2003 and didn't really end until 2010 with the National Energy Board approval and the subsequent cabinet approval. And there were several sets of overlapping hearings which made things extremely complicated, and that's part of the reason why so long was taken with the review, because there were actually 2 separate hearing bodies proceeding almost simultaneously. That one we can't blame the environmental groups for. Now this project is not going ahead. It was approved in March 2011. The certificate expires in 2017. It's clear that this project is not going to be built. And the reasons why, I seem to be missing a slide, the reasons why it's not going to be built are largely economic. The price of gas is just too low, and the cost of bringing gas from the north, given permafrost, given that there's 500 kilometers that have no roads at all, where the pipeline would have to run through in the northern part of the Mckenzie Valley, it just wasn't going to happen. And I was a participant in that process pretty much throughout, and I think that the process, the environmental assessment process, actually helped convince the proponents, and especially ExxonMobil, who was the main funder of this thing, or would have been, that this was just not going to work. This pipeline was just not going to work. And so from my way of thinking, we saved that company billions and billions of dollars, because if they built that right now, and because it would be coming on stream right about now, that gas would be stranded. They wouldn't be able to produce it and ship it economically, given the shale gas phenomenon in North America. The second project is that I wanted to talk about is the Enbridge Northern Gateway project, and this is a project to bring oil sands oil from northern Alberta to tidewater at Kitimat in British Columbia. And you see the map there. It's not that great, but anyway, it comes out on the coast, not that far from Alaska, and then they put it on tankers and they ship it to who knows where it would go to. So again, this is a long pipeline. There's actually two pipelines, one for oil, one for natural gas liquids, that actually goes the other way, and then there would be a marine terminal for very big oil tankers in a very small channel called the Douglas Channel. The big issue with respect to this project was the possibility of oil spills, both from the pipeline and from tankers in the Douglas Channel and in the Hecate Strait. There was a single joint review panel that was held with the National Energy Board involvement in that panel review. So there was only a single set of hearings, which was certainly an improvement over the Mckenzie Gas Project. And those were held over the course of a couple of years, and the project was approved by the NEB and the Cabinet last year. This project is also not going to go forward. And both for Enbridge and for the Imperial Oil ExxonMobil Consortium for the Mckenzie Gas Project, in neither of these cases have the companies formally abandoned the project, but I think it's abundantly clear that neither of these projects are going to go forward. There's a number of reasons why. In the case of Enbridge, I think probably the biggest reason is the change in the law relating to Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal title. There are several critical cases. The Chilcotin case last year, the Supreme Court recognized Aboriginal title in a specific context for a specific First Nation. So now Aboriginal people in Canada that haven't settled with Her Majesty by way of treaty, as is the case for most of British Columbia, those folks have real title to the land. And for government to displace those First Nations from those ownership rights is a very, very difficult thing to do. So this is a dramatic change in the law, I think, and it presents major problems for any sort of linear development like a pipeline going through lands that have not been for which treaties have not been signed. There's also huge resistance in British Columbia on the part of both coastal British Columbians as well as from the province of BC. The government of British Columbia has had different views, and they could well change their mind at a certain point, but certainly they have expressed a lot of concern about that pipeline. The third pipeline I want to mention is the Trans Mountain expansion. And this is an expansion of an existing pipeline from Alberta down to Vancouver. Again, it's a big pipeline. There is a pipeline there right now, so you would think it would be a lot easier to get that one built. There is a panel review. The National Energy Board is on the verge of holding hearings on that project. Perhaps as early as August. Again, there's a lot of opposition in the city of Vancouver. There will be the marine terminal. It will be at Burnaby, and they'll be offloaded into tankers, and the tankers will go from roughly one a week to one a day. This is the Salish Sea through which these tankers would go. Is a very important biologically, ecologically, birds, whales, etc. A lot of concern in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island about this project. And the one thing that the National Energy Board has done for the lawyers in the room has told participants that they no longer have the right to cross-examine the proponents. So at these hearings, you're going to have evidence being presented with no right on the part of interveners, qualified interveners, such as Nature Canada, to participate in the process, which is, it's astonishing. And why they're doing this, you know, they haven't really explained, but it could well be a result of the strict timelines that are imposed by SEIA, by federal law, in order to get the hearings done in time. That might be that's the one reason I can point to. Otherwise, it just seems like, why have hearings if you can't have a right to cross-examine? I'm looking at the lawyers, other lawyers in the panel. So on that one, I think there's a substantial likelihood of challenges by both municipalities and not-for-profits. The fourth pipeline project is the biggest of them all. It's the Energy East pipeline, which would take oil sands oil from Alberta to Quebec City and St. John. This is largely a conversion of a natural gas pipeline, but it also involves construction of about, I think, 1,600 kilometers of new pipe. And again, this pipeline will have marine terminals, or it's proposed to have new terminals at Cacouna in Quebec, near Quebec City, and on the Bay of Fundy at St. John. And that project application was filed in October 2014. Who knows when the hearings will actually be. You know, I've actually put up the wrong slide, but whatever. This was the earlier version. But let me just move towards concluding on that one. Energy East, the problem is the concern about tanker spills and pipeline spills along the route, risks of harm to birds and whales. The issue with this one, as well as for all of the other projects, has been greenhouse gas emissions. And the public resistance to all of these projects, I should say the resistance by nature groups and environmental groups to these projects has often centered on the fact that we have no plan in Canada for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and for making some sort of a transition, which we feel is necessary, from a fossil fuel-based economy to one that's based on much more efficient use of fossil fuels and also renewable energy. So there's all of these pipelines face significant challenges, and it's in terms of whether or not they actually happen. I've said that I don't think that the Northern Gateway project is ever going to happen. The Mckenzie Gas Project is not going to happen. I think the Trans Mountain project probably has got about a 50-50 chance of going forward. Energy East, I really can't see it going forward. There's been enormous resistance in the province of Quebec, focused on the marine terminal proposed at Cacouna. And the rumor is that TransCanada has actually has decided not to proceed with the terminal at Cacouna in favor of shipping all of the oil to St. John, where there is an existing marine terminal, and that would result in more oil tankers in the Bay of Fundy. Again, a very sensitive marine ecosystem, highest tides in the world, but there will be more tankers in the Bay of Fundy with the environmental effects there. And then, of course, that would mean that that you folks in the U.S. Northeast would have the benefit of some of these tankers off your shores as well. So to conclude, I would say that you know, has the new legislation made really much difference in terms of streamlining projects and getting projects through? You know, I don't think that it has. The problems that the government has are really that the legislation has really limited the rights of Canadians to participate, and a lot of folks are just frankly discouraged with the process that exists right now, and And as a result, there has been a lot of resistance to them. So we'll have to see how that goes. But the way I see it right now, I just, you're having trouble with getting Keystone approved in the United States. Well, we've got the same sort of problems in Canada. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Turn it over to Fred next for a little perspective on the United States.
Good morning. Nice to be here. I got called by Andy, and he said he wanted us to me to offer an overview of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act in the U.S., and do it in about 10 minutes. I told him that it reminded me of this story. Great Rabbi Hillel was teaching out in the public square and teaching, all sorts of Jewish law and whatnot. And apparently some really cheeky a student from another city came up to the rabbi and he said, "If you're so great, if you're so wise, teach me all about your teaching and your Torah while standing on one foot." The rabbi thought for a moment, and he hopped up on one foot, and he said, "Love thy neighbor as thyself. The rest is commentary. Now go study." And so that was his way of trying to summarize something very complicated in a very short period of time. What I'm going to try to do is give a perspective on the application of NEPA to private development and the rules that apply in the U.S., and some of the trends and policies that are going on right now. And then I'm going to be very happy to take all sorts of questions because there's a lot more to discuss than that. So with NEPA, it's a look before you leap statute. Government agencies need to know about the consequences of their actions before they do it. Quite as simple as that. Not a substantive statute. By that, it means that you could propose the absolutely most detrimental environmental impacts at a project, but that in and of itself doesn't mean that the project shouldn't go forward. As long as the agency looks at it carefully and the public has an opportunity to think about it, you could go ahead and do it. NEPA doesn't say don't do an environmentally bad thing. It just think about doing an environmentally bad thing and hopefully do it a little bit better. And obviously, not just accede to the fact that there are negative environmental impacts, but try to figure out how it would work through an alternatives analysis and through mitigation opportunity. So for the most part, when you think about NEPA and you think about federal work, you think about things that the government does. So if the Department of Defense wants to build a new Army base, obviously NEPA would apply. If the Army Corps of Engineers was going to dredge a harbor for levees or for flooding control, obviously that would apply, and so on and so forth. The U.S. Forest Service wanted to think about how it was going to manage a piece of property, a forest, that's a forest plan. The Forest Service would have to comply with NEPA. But that isn't really where kind of most of the problem is, or really some of where the challenges are in terms of the relationship between industry sectors and the government. The challenge often becomes when there are project proponents that are in the private sector that need some measure of federal approval. And the notion under NEPA law, is called small handles. That's kind of the term that's come to the fore over these years. And that means it just has to be a little bit of federal responsibility, federal decision-making that would trigger environmental review. So let me give you an example of a small handle. You are a housing developer, and you're going to build a 250-unit housing development. It's going to have a golf course, environmental reviews for Stephen and his group, lots of buffers, and a bird watching area. And it sounds really, really good. Except in order to build this housing development, you need to build a bridge to get to where the people are, to where the houses are going to be. And that bridge crosses a stream. Waters of the United States. You therefore need a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. The Army Corps of Engineers has to say yay or nay to that permit. Boom. The private developer who thinks that he or she is just building homes, a golf course, and a bird watching area now has to comply with NEPA because the Army Corps of Engineers has to grant them a permit and make a decision on that permit. Query, is the Army Corps of Engineers a housing developer? A loaded question. No, it is not. But it is responsible for assessing not just the impacts of crossing the stream, but the ancillary indirect effects of the development that's going to be permitted by allowing that stream to be crossed. And hence the problem, and hence the challenge that we see in NEPA. Now multiply that by 100 times when a private entity wants to explore a mine or build a pipeline or do oil and gas exploration, right? Where something gets really, really serious. But the challenge is still the same. You have a private entity proposing something to build, and sometimes it's even another level of government. Sometimes it's another state government, like a state wanting to build a highway or a state wanting to build a transit project. The same thing applies. They need approval or funding from the federal government. That's the small handle. And the question is, are the approving entities the experts in any certain thing? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes there's absolutely no expertise in what's being approved. Sometimes there's a lot of expertise, but only a few people. And so you have a couple of people trying to handle a huge project. A $15 billion project was one of those numbers I saw on Stephen's slides. And you have 2 people at the agency that are responsible for reviewing all the pipelines. And I'm not exaggerating. So what does that mean in terms of the dynamic of trying to comply with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act? Well, in the US, the way it normally works is that the private party can do the analysis. In fact, they do the analysis. By law, that's perfectly permitted. So long as the agencies that have jurisdiction, other agencies that want to comment, like our U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and members of the public, have an opportunity to review that analysis and have input, make comments to try to figure out, are there other alternatives to do this project? Are there ways to mitigate impacts for certain of the things that have been identified, and so on and so forth? Well, that sounds really good, except that sometimes the analysis that lands on the desk of the federal agency is, shall we say, quite robust, right? You're talking about loose leaves upon loose leaves and volumes, technical data. And yet it's the agency that signs off on the bottom line, not Acme Pipeline Company, not Acme Road Building Company, not Acme Transmission Line Company. It's the agency that approves it. And yet they have to now just apply their expertise on the things that they know about, which may not be the projects, but maybe the resources. The Army Corps of Engineers knows about wetlands, but it doesn't know about housing development, in my example. And then take an independent review of that information and make a determination. Is this the best alternative? Are there other alternatives? Give you a good example. Worked for a client that was building a housing development at a golf course, and they hired, I'm not kidding, Jack Nicklaus himself. Jack Nicklaus was the golf course designer, as some of you know who golf. He has a big design company that builds golf courses. And Jack Nicklaus himself came out to the site to see what was going on at this thing. And who's the approving agency? The Army Corps of Engineers, because we were using waters of the US. So we go out on the site, and Jack is there with the project team, and Jack looks over this particular landscape, and he says to the gathered people, and he says, "This will be my signature hole." Right? And for those of you who don't golf, a signature hole is the hole where you walk away from the experience remembering the vistas and the views and the scenery or something like that. That's a signature hole. And most of the people around the gathering are relatively impressed. And they're going, ooh, ah, they're looking at what's going on, because it's actually quite beautiful. It's going to cross a lake and wetlands. It's really beautiful. You can imagine all the golf balls plopping into the water, but it's a gorgeous vista. One person was not impressed. It was the mitigation expert from the Army Corps of Engineers, who, while everybody is oohing and eyeing, envisioning what this might look like, speaks up, straight face, "Mr. Nicklaus, you may think this is your signature hole, but to me, this is my signature mitigation project." Nicholas says, "Excuse me?" He says, "Yes, if you just cut it here or cut it here, move your tee here, use less water here and whatnot." And Nicholas says, "But then I'll have a 55-yard hole. I won't have." Therein defines the problem. And I think it's a little bit silly, but again, multiply it by tenfold, 100-fold, when you start talking about things that are more complex, like mines or projects or pipelines. The vision of the federal agency is their domain, their jurisdiction, protect that resource. The dominion of the private party developer is, this is what I'm going to build. I need your approval, but this is what I'm going to build. I know about housing developments. I know about golf courses. What do you know about? And what they know about is the resource. Therein lies the tension when you deal with private parties seeking federal review under NEPA. It isn't just private parties and the agencies, it's sometimes agencies to agencies. My colleague Carol here, I worked with her at the Department of Transportation. You would think that if a state or a federal agency wants to build a highway or transit project, you know, our president has been talking about infrastructure, getting people to work, and that would get a lot of support. But when you get in a meeting just like this with all these people to review that project, and EPA sitting at the table, you'll just give me a high sign, right? An EPA sitting around the table and all the rest, you hear oftentimes, well, if you just move the road there, we'll be happy. There happens to be through a community with about 50 homes. Where the road is now may be close to a stream, there may be where the homes. And so the agency has to deal with its sister agency to say what we're trying to balance is the harm to the community versus harm to the environment. And how do you do that? And that's some of the tension that you see in the US application of NEPA. There's a lead agency, the Department of Transportation, but all the commenting agencies like the EPA, the Army Corps, and things like that. Different missions, but all engaged in the same process to try to get to a result and answer a decision on a project that takes all those things into account. And oftentimes that results in some of the things you heard about from our Canadian colleagues about delays in time. You can look at it one of two ways. That's good, because that's what should happen. Input results in better projects. It results in better environmental outcomes. You can look at it another way. That's bad, because too much input results in delays and projects going on and on and on, and the developers need certainty. They're making an investment in a market, like now-ish. And if you say, well, we'll get you a decision 5-6 years from now, then their whole analysis of whether they could sell 250 homes, whether they can sell 200 homes, that's out the window. And so the tension between certainty in development, timing and investment versus environmental review is extremely prominent in the US, which will lead me to my last topic, which is consistent with what we've heard already, and I'll give you the American view on streamlining. In the American government, that is the S word. We no longer use that word. It's perceived as a bad word. It connotes cutting corners and not doing things the way you should do it. So now you hear the federal government, you'll hear the administration, the folks I work with talk about efficiencies in environmental review. You won't hear streamlining. I'll use the S word because it's quicker. Streamlining in the US is an attempt to make more transparent the review process in an effort to provide certainty to the applicants and to the public with respect to the time it takes to get to a decision and transparency in how you got to that decision. That's the overview. We do not have deadlines like yours, like within 365 days or whatnot. We have goals, we have targets, but no deadlines. So our streamlining review and proposals provide transparency, like putting the project schedules and the reviews up on websites, public-facing websites, so that if we're waiting for a decision from the Department of the Interior on such and such a permit, and it's delayed, the public can see where it's delayed. Not just the public, but the secretary and the other secretary from the other agencies. So transparency is one way to do it. Streamlining in terms of the process itself also involves coordinating actions between these various players that I described and trying to front load the process so they're all at the table together now instead of later. One of the maladies of the NEPA process over time has been the lead agency goes ahead and does its thing, feels it's ready to go, and then it presents its findings to its sister agencies. And the sister agencies, well, that's all well and good for you, but I've never looked at this. This is the first time I've seen this. And oftentimes you maybe not start from the very beginning, but close to it. So under streamlining provisions under federal law in the transportation sector, a statute called MAP 21, passed in 2012. And right now in the current Congress, there are no fewer than a dozen. And I'm not kidding. A dozen different streamlining measures depending on the industry, whether it's pipelines, transmission lines, energy, rail. They're all out there, and they're all very similar, but they have the theme of getting the analysis up front so everyone's sitting at the table together now, raising your concerns now, not later, with the idea that the mitigation can be brought into play earlier, the decision-making can be enhanced earlier, and therefore done more quickly. Does it work? The answer is yes. Unlike what you heard from Stephen in our experience, certainly in the transportation sector where I came from at the US DOT, I'd say the answer is yes. I'll give you one example and then I'll pass it off to Jim and then happy to talk with questions. The Tappan Zee Bridge, for those of you not familiar, is the scariest bridge in the United States of America. It's up north of Manhattan in New York, crosses the Hudson River. It's scary not because it's really high or because it's really narrow. It's scary because you think it's going to fall into the Hudson River any moment now. Built for maybe 30, 40,000 car daily traffic, carries 140,000 daily traffic. Getting close to its useful life and really needs to be replaced. Everybody knew it needed to be replaced. To do so would cost only about $4 or $5 billion. Governor Andrew Cuomo took office and said, I'm going to get the new Tappan Zee Bridge built. So you're going to do the EIS, and you're going to do it quickly, because I'm going to be there for the ribbon cutting. You know, politicians like the ribbon cuttings. We finished the environmental impact statement for the Tappan Zee Bridge, Andy, in 18 months. The average for a major transportation project like that in the U.S. is somewhere between 5 and 7 years. It's getting better, but we got it done in 18 months. We got it done because there was a dispute resolution process in place. The agencies were all at the table at the same place. Even project opponents, in that case the river keepers up in New York by Bobby Kennedy's shop up in New York, they were at the table and they were engaged in some of the decision-making process. We identified the key issues that everybody knew was going to be a problem, and we handled them right up front. What were they? They were dredging, Hudson River, slightly polluted. There were a couple of endangered species, sturgeon, in the Hudson, so we dealt with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we came up with great mitigation projects to help protect the sturgeon. And it was also, of course, the traffic impacts of building a new bridge and how that was going to be handled. We dealt with all of them up front. The Army Corps was with us. The Fish and Wildlife Service was with us. The river keepers were with us at the table. There was a decision-making process, so if there was an impasse, it went directly to the boss, the secretary, the director, the Corps of Engineers, et cetera. 18 months later, we signed a decision document, and the U.S. called a record of decision. The bridge is now under construction. It can be done. And I'm here to say that streamlining is not a dirty word if it's done properly, and it honors some of the participation that Stephen says may be being sacrificed in Canada with its new provision. We'll talk about that. But there's a gazillion more things to talk about underneath, but Jim is going to talk about half of those gazillion things, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred and the rest of the panelists. I want to take a few minutes to talk about a couple of issues that have been raised tangentially from the perspective of U.S. NEPA practice. One of them is, of course, the relationship between state and federal agencies and the extent to which environmental impact assessment applies at the state level or at the federal level in the U.S. We have a much more diffuse and entrepreneurial system, I think, in some ways than most of the countries that do environmental impact assessment, in that we don't have a system that clearly defines this is a state project and this is a federal project. The federal NEPA law applies to major federal actions. And so whether it's a small handle or a large handle, if there is a major federal action, and major has to do with the definition of the impacts, not the size of the project, there will be federal environmental impact review. That review may be a full environmental impact statement process like the Tappan Zee Bridge, or it may be an environmental assessment, which is an abbreviated process, which leads typically to mitigation. It may be a categorical exclusion, which says, we've seen this before, we know what the impacts are, they're always the same, and absent extraordinary circumstances, we can just approve this without any additional environmental analysis. So that's on the federal side. The question then is, what about state decision-making? We have, by some counts, 15, by other counts, 20 or more states that have environmental impact laws, but to be honest, there are only 5 or 6 of them that have environmental impact review laws that are anything like NEPA. Those include, though, important states like California, where we have a great deal of environmental practice and litigation, Washington State, Massachusetts, New York. Tappan Zee Bridge required analysis under the state environmental impact assessment law as well as under the federal NEPA. Montana, another one that's important for some of the processes that we have. But in many states, there's no environmental impact assessment law at all. So unless there's a federal handle of some kind, the process escapes the kind of comprehensive environmental impact assessment that we were talking about throughout most of this presentation. If you're not in one of those major states and you're building a housing development and you don't cross a water of the United States, you cross an isolated pond, there's no environmental impact assessment that applies because there's no federal hook. There's no federal handle. So it's important to keep in mind the differences that you will experience depending on whether your project is in one of those states that has a robust environmental impact assessment law of its own, or whether it doesn't. And if you're in a state that doesn't have such a law, the only question there is there a federal action, a federal decision being made that's sufficient to trigger federal NEPA? One of the other things that's worth looking at is who controls or operates the process, and NEPA doesn't create a super body or a council that actually directs and oversees environmental impact assessment for the whole country. It leaves it to the action or decision agency. In Fred's example, that's often the Army Corps of Engineers because the trigger is, are you filling the waters of the United States? But in many cases, there are several federal agencies that have decision issues. And each one of them is responsible for making sure that the environmental impact assessment that will support their decision document is done. NEPA encourages and promotes cooperation among federal agencies so that this is all done at the same time, but in many cases, there are sequential decisions, and some agencies say, why should we spend our budget money or time dealing with a gold mining project that needs a road, but if the gold mine itself is never approved, we may never get to the road, and so we might not get to that decisional aspect. But the desire or the hope is that those things will be coordinated. And CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality, when they developed the NEPA regulations in 1978, created a concept of cooperating agency. And the cooperating agency is a concept which I think deserves a great deal more attention in the U.S. for efficiency purposes and I won't use the S word if I can help it, for making the process more transparent and effective. The cooperating agency is an agency that has a decision to make, or in the words of the CEQ regulations, has expertise in the subject matter of the decision. And the interesting thing is that cooperating agencies can also include state and local governments that have decision or expertise, and it's regardless of whether those state or local governments are in states with environmental impact laws. So if you're a state which has to make a set of decisions and there is a small federal handle with the Corps of Engineers, the regulations at least allow you the opportunity to become or consider becoming a cooperating agency. This can also be important for Indian tribes. The regulations only speak to tribes becoming cooperating agencies if there is an impact on, quote, the reservation, which is entirely insufficient as a description of the interests or relationships that tribes might have. But it hasn't always precluded those kind of relationships. There's at least one instance I'm aware of where an Alaska Native village became a cooperating agency on a federal decision in Alaska where they actually had a decision to make and where they were more expert on the marine mammals and fisheries than anyone else in that particular area. So the cooperating agency relationship is one that I think deserves a great deal more exploration and robust development. I want to say a couple more things about things that were touched on earlier. Enforcement and mitigation is a perennial problem in the U.S. You have to identify mitigation in your NEPA documents, but the enforceability doesn't exist unless the mitigation is, measures are reflected in the permits and contract documents. And the instrument of enforcement is you're enforcing the permit or you're enforcing the contract document. And if someone leaves that out or forgets that or deviates from that, you can't go back and say, yes, but it was in the environmental impact statement. CEQ issued a guidance document a couple years ago now, attempting to identify enforceability of mitigation as more important and suggesting ways in which that might be done. But it's an area that deserves more attention, and to the extent we're looking for efficiencies and trade-offs, I think the public will have a lot more confidence in environmental impact review if the enforceability of mitigation is guaranteed up front. CEQ in its draft guidance document on mitigation actually suggested that if you don't do the mitigation, you have to redo the environmental impact analysis. They got pushback externally and backed off that stance and said, well, you might want to consider whether you have to redo the environmental impact analysis. I frankly think that if you fail to do the mitigation, your analysis no longer describes the project accurately, and in my view, you would need to update or supplement that environmental impact analysis. The guidance says, think about it. The last point I want to touch on is the timing and timeline issue. It's the perennial problem. How long does it take to do environmental impact review? From the proponent's point of view, it's always too long. And what are the ways of shortening that? Well, the approach that we heard about that was done in the Canadian Environmental Assessment Law revisions in 2012 were to set an end date for performance of the federal review. We have, by and large, not taken that approach in the U.S. Some of the state systems actually do have timelines. Our federal system, we have not adopted timelines, and there have been moves in Congress that Fred alluded to set hard and fast deadlines. Even some bills that have suggested if you don't meet the deadline, the project is deemed approved, which sort of creates an incentive to miss the deadline from some points of view. If it's deemed approved, regardless of what the analysis says, that may create some very strange incentives. My own view is that these projects and their impacts vary in size, and I prefer to look for efficiencies and cooperating agency approaches and transparency rather than to set a deadline. In some cases, if you set a deadline, the answer will have to be no, because we just don't know enough about the project. And so folks thinking that deadlines will result in faster project approvals may be disappointed. It may result in faster project disapprovals. So it's worth thinking about all of these things where we have these competing interests, particularly private projects coming in contact with federal approvals and federal NEPA. Sometimes delay is a really bad thing. When I was in private practice, I also had an experience like Stephen referred to, where a client of mine spent a great many years. There was an environmental impact statement. It was litigated statement. By the time they finished the process of litigating it, it was pretty clear that had the client built the project, they would have lost a great deal of money. And so they also privately were grateful that they had been spared the downside of their own investment, even though it's not the way they would have preferred to go. I'll leave it there.
All right, perfect. I'm just going to ask one question to kind of kick us off here on the question and answer session. But if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. Just make sure you speak into the mic, say your name and any affiliation. So the first question I have, and this is actually probably more for our American panelists, just because I know it happened relatively quickly when we touched on it. The new CEQ guidance on greenhouse gas emissions and how they've been expanded over the last, since December, I think, when they were announced. Any insight on that from you guys in terms of what this means for projects going forward, how this is going to affect particularly energy projects, I would assume, but all kinds of projects in the future?
Yeah, I'll start. I won't say that the guidance issued by CEQ expanded the analysis of GHGs, but attempted to clarify it. What had been happening is that agencies were kind of all over the map. Some agencies were trying to delve in very specifically in terms of numbers and crunching numbers and trying to come up tons of carbon per project, and others were doing it and touching it at a very, very high level. And I think what CEQ tried to do is try to say, hey, look, try to define the nature of your project and then pick a corresponding level of analysis and type of analysis for GHGs that makes sense according to your project. So for example, if you are the Highway Transportation Safety Administration and you're responsible for setting efficiency standards for vehicles, so many miles per gallon, and you're going to set a standard for light trucks that for the entire fleet of light trucks that it should be 30 miles per gallon as opposed to some other number, 35 or 40 or 45. That's going to have a huge impact on GHG emissions, right? Because it's a whole fleet of trucks, the light truck that's going to last for 20 to 30 years. And if the standard is here as opposed to here, that's going to be big. So maybe you should be looking at that more quantitatively because you have an opportunity to do so. Because you can imagine an analysis about how many trucks are expected to be sold, how many have been sold in the past, what the emissions might be, assuming the technologies, so many miles per gallon, yada, yada, yada. And that's pretty much what the courts have said, and CEQ said that's appropriate for that. By contrast, if you're going to do some other sort of project that it doesn't necessarily go to that sort of decision, a more qualitative analysis is perfectly appropriate because it may not necessarily be even amenable to the type of analysis that you can put in context this small project with respect to the overall global commons of GHGs. So a more qualitative analysis is appropriate. So that's really what they encouraged. The one thing that I would argue might be considered in an expansion is that the CEQ encouraged its resource agency partners, people like the Bureau of Land Management, people like the Fish and Wildlife Service, people like the Forest Service, to consider GHGs in their planning documents. A lot of these agencies do, as by statute, by American statute, routine planning every 10 to 20 years. Forest plans, grasslands, rangeland plans, they're all plans, big plans, big thick plans. And obviously how you manage those resources, X amount for wilderness, Y amount for extraction, Z amount for something else, could clearly have a big impact in terms of what resources would be extracted, the energy associated to get those resources, the use of those resources, et cetera. And so what CEQ has said is, look, in those plans, incorporate GHG analysis in your alternatives analysis. Again, it doesn't have to be specific, but let's just give a range so people understand what the differences are and the impacts for GHGs, and try to incorporate that more routinely in your planning documents. I would argue that's kind of the biggest expansion. I don't know if Jim agrees or disagrees with that, but I think what they're trying to help the agencies is to figure out the best way to do it, because there's been some cases where the agencies have done nothing, and the courts have said, that's fine. Why? Because it's really impossible to make a sense of your project vis-a-vis this global problem. There's other instances where courts have said that wasn't fine, because really the nature of your action is so broad that you really should be taking a more quantitative look. So CEQ was trying to say, okay, if you're going to do this case by case, what's a reasonable way to do this case by case? I think that's what they were trying to do.
I would say they did maybe two other things that are of interest and related to what Fred said. One is that they said it's no longer good enough to say the contribution of this project and connected actions is minimal compared to overall greenhouse gas
That's how we do
emissions.
things in Canada.
Well, that's tended to be the way many agencies have done things here. And CEQ said, that's not enough. Where you have information available to you that suggests what that contribution might be, you should disclose that information. So that's setting at least a floor on the kind of hand-waving approach that we've had. And then the other aspect of that is that while the greenhouse gas effects of a given decision might not be that substantial in the larger scheme of things, it will enable you to determine which among your alternatives is perhaps more friendly to the climate. And in the interest of look before you leap, deciding among those in terms of climate impacts is a piece of useful information. So, even though not determinative, informative, and I think CEQ underlined that in the new guidance.
Right, and Jim, I had one other thing, just amending my comments. One other thing, I think there was an aspect of resilience and adaptation that CEQ encouraged agencies to think about in terms of framing alternatives. In the transportation context, you could imagine if your facility, your road facility is close to the shore, maybe you should be thinking of adaptation and resilience. If your bridge is 10 feet above sea level, maybe you need to be considering 12 or 14 feet, for example. You know, those type of things were encouraged.
Okay, I think we can take our first question right here.
Thank you. Myron Ebel, Competitive Enterprise Institute. My question is primarily for Ms. Cutts, but it concerns the differences between Canada's permitting and review process and the United States. One of the things that I think Mr. Kellfish and Mr. Wagner haven't really brought up is that not only are there interagency delays in our environmental impact statement process, but there are it has provided huge opportunities for delaying litigation. And we now have, for example, a major mining project in this country now takes 10, 15, or 20 years to get permitted. And to give you an example of a smaller kind of thing, we no longer really cut trees in our national forests. We allow them to die through disease and fire, and then we have salvage logging. But salvage logging invokes NEPA generally, and then environmental groups come in and litigate that. And so by the time the permit is granted to do the salvage logging and the contract is issued, the timber no longer has any value. And so I'm wondering, it seems to me your environmental reform legislation, review reform legislation, has tried to speed up your process, but your process was already much faster than ours in most cases. And I wonder if you have any comments on looking at what you're trying to do and what we're suffering from here in the United States.
Well, certainly there were considerations of global competitiveness for Canada when the review of legislation was undertaken. And so the initiative that the government started with was responsible resource development, and it did bring about the repeal of our old act and a new act, but it also brought changes to the Fisheries Act. It brought changes to the permitting process. And so the idea on that, the streamlining side of things anyway, was to give greater predictability to investors so that they wouldn't face a potential delay of 8 to 10 years, and that they would have an idea of when things would be completed. So in addition to the effort to put timelines into our legislation, there were also some regulatory changes on the permitting side so that those would also move along quickly. What we do when we are working on environmental assessment is we work with the other federal agencies very closely, so the types of information we're collecting can be used by the permitting authority, that they can see what's happening, and then they can move more efficiently when their turn comes. Now, obviously, when a proponent comes in with a particular project design, they're usually at a stage where the project design is at a fairly high level. Sometimes the information the permitters need is at a later stage in the engineering process, but to the extent that the basic information that's available at the time of the EA is useful to the permitters, we share it with them at that time.
Can I make an additional comment? You're talking about interagency duplication. Under the previous law, we had so-called self-assessment system, so that each of the federal departments and agencies, if there was a permit that they had to issue, that they would take responsibility for that assessment. But then, of course, there's often, for different projects, a number of federal departments or agencies who might be the responsible authority. Under the new Act, there's only 3 responsible authorities: the National Energy Board, the Environmental Assessment Agency, where Helen works, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Board. So under the previous Act, there was huge delays relating to interagency squabbling as to who was going to have to step forward and actually start doing the work and commissioning the consultants and all the rest of it. There's been a huge improvement that way, I think. So this is a much, talk about, streamlining that's not a bad word, sort of a good word, I would even say. There's been a big improvement that way, because you can't have Department of Fisheries and Department of Transport arguing for months and years about who's actually going to take responsibility for doing the assessment for a project. So that's been a big change, in my view.
Also discuss the opportunities for endless litigation. Do you have those?
Well, I think that the new Act has brought forth many more opportunities for endless litigation. There were lots of opportunities under the old Act. Under the new Act, there's all sorts of new ones. I think one of them is the whole question of who qualifies as an interested party for the purposes of an environmental assessment review. There's a legal test whether or not you can actually be a participant in a joint panel review, and this is not working well for the government, and it's got a lot of people very annoyed, and there's litigation in the courts, and there will be lots more. There's lots of opportunities for litigation under the new Act. Some of them are playing out. Some of them are still to come. I mentioned the one about removing the right of cross-examination of witnesses for the National Energy Board hearings in the Trans Mountain project. I mean, this is, for lawyers, I mean, this is unconscionable what they've done, and it's unprecedented. And there will be lawsuits over this, and I feel sorry for the folks at Kinder Morgan, because I think this particular pipeline project is perhaps the easiest to approve of the 4 that I've mentioned. So, yeah, lots of litigation to come.
Yeah, let me correct a perception on litigation, if I may, before the next question. It isn't the litigation in and of itself that delays things. I mean, let's be clear. A lot of the new laws have statutes of limitations that you have to bring suit within 150 days of a final decision to help expedite the case and make sure that the things are getting airing quickly. What delays the litigation delay effect is because agencies or private parties engaged in the NEPA review process are so fearful of an adverse result from litigation, even before it's brought, that they gold plate their analyses. I brought a prop, just in answer to this question. This is my prop. What is this? This is the 1971 environmental impact statement for proposal to drill 2 wells off the coast of California near Santa Barbara, 2 years after NEPA was passed. This is the impact statement. It is 27 pages long. It would never be done this way now. The consultants would write, 2,700 pages. I don't know what the number is, but it's huge, right? They do it because they're fearful of litigation. It's not the litigation itself. That is on us in a lot of ways. If we do the process better, if we make it more transparent, if we focus on the things that matter as opposed to things that don't, if we don't accept the norm that an impact statement has to be 2,700 pages, then we can fix it ourselves during the process and not have to necessarily cater the process to answer every possible question in litigation. So there's a little bit of a misperception there. We're trying to work on it here in the U.S.
Hi, Allison Good with FTI Consulting. My question is also for Ms. Cutts. I'm sure, as you're well aware, there are tons of LNG projects proposed for various parts of Canada, and I was wondering if you could talk about You mentioned federal versus provincial sort of effects of your environmental assessment process, and I was wondering if you could maybe detail what sorts of specific issues have come up in relation to LNG export projects between federal government and provincial governments.
Yeah, I can give you a bit of an overview on that. The LNG projects in Canada are mainly concentrated on the West Coast in British Columbia. And probably the biggest issue is where the particular locations are. For example, there are ones where they're in an area where it's very sensitive to fish. That there is, for example, a particular type of eelgrass that is important for salmon, and there are concerns that a particular project will disturb that eelgrass and therefore harm the salmon population. So certainly, fish is a major issue for LNG. What we're doing in British Columbia is that it is the sole province that's asked for substitution. And so we do have 4 or 5 projects, LNG projects, where we have substituted with British Columbia. And so I'm not very familiar with the details on them, but one area of exclusion for substitution is if there is federal land involved. And so in the case that I was speaking about with the eelgrass, there is some federal land because there's a federal port there, so we are involved in that particular LNG.
Hi, I'm Rachel McCormick from the Canadian Embassy, and one of my jobs is to translate the differences between Canadian and U.S. approaches, so I'm going to take advantage of our U.S. experts. One of the things Helen profiled was that with the changes in 2012, there's a consolidation in terms of the process within the Canadian government and consolidation of the decision-making authority. And the difference, of course, in the U.S. is it's spread out over a number of agencies, and so a transmission line's DOE, pipeline is Ferc or state, depending on where it is. Another difference, Stephen talked about the domestic pipelines being assessed. In the U.S. in the last 3 years, there's actually been 50 pipelines approved, and there's been an increase of like 3 million barrels per day flowing on pipelines as a result. So there's a big difference there. And I wanted to get your input and thoughts on whether that's because the domestic assessment process differs from the process that crosses a boundary, an international boundary, or if it's because of state level processes kicking in, or like why do you think the difference is in terms of the number of pipelines that have been approved in the U.S. versus in Canada, and whether that consolidation is coming in the U.S. in terms of the decision-making authority instead of having it spread out across the agencies?
There are a lot of questions in there. I would think that one of the aspects on approval of pipelines in the U.S. is that many of those pipelines are traversing states which don't have their own environmental impact assessment laws, and so there is no place for that kind of review to have occurred. And while some of them may have required federal approval, the types of federal approval that's required is in many cases fairly minimal, or the type of federal decision that is made. In many cases, the biggest federal decision or the federal handle is as in the housing development example, stream crossings. And so the analysis tends not to be as complete or full as it might be, or as it might be under some of the examples that we've talked about in Canada. We do have instances where pipelines have been stalled out, where there have been pretty substantial federal resources, some crossing federal wildlife refuges and parklands and the like, which have triggered a much more robust analysis. I suppose because each agency manages its own NEPA review process, that may account for some of the distinctions that we're seeing that you might not get in a federal kind of aspect. And I suppose the implication of is this different from transnational issues might have more to do with the State Department having a single or one or two big things on its plate as opposed to having hundreds of pipelines on its plate.
Yeah, the short answer, would there be a consolidation? No. No, NEPA is going to remain the province of each of the agencies that take the lead. That's not really going to change in the U.S. system. For the pipeline phenomenon you described, obviously some of it relating to the market and driven by the market and what needs to be transported. And I'd say that the difference, in my experience from our practice, Jim, is that it's the difference between interstate and intra-state projects. For the ones that are just within the boundaries of a state, yes, the pipelines go up, and they're actually pretty quick. But for the ones that are going across state boundaries now, the phenomenon is getting worse, not better. And that's for two reasons. One, Ferc, the agency that handles it, this is an editorial comment on my part. People may disagree. Ferc has buried its head in the sand about NEPA review and the way it's done NEPA. It does it the way it's always done it. It hasn't really responded to changes in environmental analysis and review. And as a result, there's been a few projects that have been dinged because they haven't done it properly. They haven't done good cumulative impacts analyses. They look at the pipeline this way, and if it connects to 3 or 4 different pipelines, they say that's not what we're analyzing, which is completely wrong. From a NEPA perspective, that has to be taken into account. And it's gotten so bad at FERC that last week, they issued a rule in the Federal Register to deal with this problem. And what was the rule? I'm not making this up. You could check it out. It's in the Federal Register. It's rules to prevent disruption at the FERC hearings, because protesters and people who have been very upset about the explosion of these pipeline issues have been interrupting the hearings. And so rather than deal with their NEPA regulations and their NEPA process, FERC's idea is to issue regulations to prevent people from speaking up at their hearings. It's an agency that's stuck in its process about 15, 20 years ago. It wouldn't be too hard to reform it so that it could be better. So there's going to be, I believe, more issues, not less, in terms of the bigger pipeline projects in the U.S., and I think it's going to be more like what Steve has been describing than not.
We got time for one more question.
When a project is...
Oh, ma'am, could you just wait for the microphone? Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Right behind you.
Behind you.
Diane Seeger. When a project is discontinued, but it's kind of hanging in limbo, what happens next? Is it just dropped, or what happens to the money, the impact, the next step? And is any analysis done before they go into this process? It might be too long, or it would impact on wildlife or cities, along the way.
I mean, I could speak to Canada a little bit. I mean, in the case of the Mckenzie Gas Project, which I mentioned, the National Energy Board issued a certificate that had a 6-year duration, and in the final argument before the board, the board was very clear that after 6 years, the companies would have to come back again. So once the 6 years are up, the company will no longer have authority to build the project. But until that happens, I mean, everything really is in limbo, and it's up to the companies to decide whether or not they feel like they can make some money off this project or not and go forward. So I think usually the National Energy Board will have time limits on its certificates, so that companies will have to build the project within that prescribed period, or else risk having that certificate pulled. For other types of projects, other types of agencies, it's all different. But it's up to the proponent to decide, and the proponent can in the course of the environmental assessment, the proponent can stop work, take a time out, come back in. It's a lot of the delays that happen in the Canadian system are a result of proponents playing some politics, like the Mckenzie Gas Project that I mentioned. Most of the delays were actually because the proponents were trying to get a better deal with First Nations and were creating, putting pressure on the First Nations and on the federal government that they could get a better deal, and probably in trying to extract some federal money to build some roads in the north. I mean, that was the reason for a lot of the delays. So, but the proponents really do hold most of the timing cards, really.
Andy, just two comments quick. The U.S. rule has a standard of supplementation, so that if the market dictates that a project needs to be put on hold or there's no money to do a project, you can stop. But if it takes a certain period of time and then the world changes around you and there's new facts and circumstances, NEPA has a supplementation standard where you don't have to start the whole thing over again necessarily, but you have to tackle the things that may have changed, so that there's up-to-date review, so the review isn't stale. So we have that kind of standard here as well. So that's kind of how that works. Andy, this is completely unrelated, but it's kind of a shameless plug for those of you out in the audience. Please check out this blog that I write that deals with all these issues. If you want, there's an ongoing discussion of NEPA and NEPA process and reviews. I've talked about all this. A very simple blog. It's called EnviroStructure, like environment and infrastructure. EnviroStructure, one word, envirostructure.com. We cover all these issues, and we'd love to hear from you. If you follow that blog, you could sign and get those notes. And yeah, I think Jim follows it, don't you, Jim?
Assiduously.
What does that word mean again?
That means he's going to now. But so I hope that answers your question in terms of the stopping the process. Thanks.
Well, anyways, if we could give our panel a huge round of applause for today's program. Anyways, thank you very much. Have a great day.
You were talking about that Tappan Zee Bridge.
Yeah.
We used to have
Gone on for another hour.
Oh, yes, of
mediation
course.
that allowed